very often they are lost. They don't know what to do, who to go, who to contact, how to set up their life as refugees. Each of them is trying to find their own way to cope, trying to find their own way to sort accommodation, work, and so on. Is there any UN program or agency which deals with informing those Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine, who are refugees, so that they would understand what to do in this situation? Thank you. I would give the floor to Viktoriia Andrievska now. Thank you so much for this question. Indeed, UNHCR works a lot with those Ukrainians who are now in Europe. I'm talking about the figures. Starting February 24th, over 6 million, 124 refugees have found shelter in Europe. UNHCR has a special page on the web, and you can find the contacts of our offices there in different countries, and you can contact UNHCR office and get information there. So my advice to people who are at the moment coming from Ukraine to different countries to use this opportunity and to contact UNHCR's offices in European countries.
Hi, the New York Times. I have two questions related to food and hunger, one maybe for the FAO and the other for the WFP. My first is, what plans are underway now in terms of helping Ukrainians to get grain out of the country? What do you see as the realistic options? And my second question, which is about the impact on global hunger, what are the areas that you're most concerned about being indirectly, basically affected by the war in Ukraine?
So I think the first question should go to FAO.
Thank you so much for this question. Indeed, there's a big problem with exporting food from Ukraine. We know that now the scope of the export has reduced greatly. So FAO now is working close with the Ministry of Agricultural Policies and is now calling for the reopening of the ports, for the deblockade and reopening the ports in Odessa. And also we are helping find alternative routes of export, and we are developing alternative strategies so that produce from Ukraine will be supplied in other countries. Because indeed, there are many countries, especially in Africa, who are very dependent on supplies from Ukraine. And for Anthem.
Yeah, we know the Western European countries are working and we're looking to get the ports reopened. And this is really the only option to get the proper capacity that we need for exports. But we're also looking at safer ports, overland exports as well. The capacity is limited, but there is potential to increase that. According to our calculations, there's a potential for about 15 to 20% of what was feasible through the ports. However, the prominence of the Black Sea ports means that alternative export routes have insufficient infrastructure to be viable, sustainable alternatives to the required scale, and that's why it's so important we get the ports reopened. But obviously, we're not the politicians, and that's not our role, but we are monitoring that closely and hope to get, as soon as ports are reopened, that we can be in exporting again.
We've heard that up to 20% of the world population might feel the impact of the war when it comes to food, because of grains and because of other things involved. Could you specify what areas we should watch and what areas globally are your biggest concern? This will be to Paul. I think the question was about some specific geography that we should focus on.
Yes, specifically, we're talking about countries which are in deep degrees of hunger. So we're talking about Syria, we're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about Yemen. These are the type of emergencies where we're looking at people already on the brink and facing starvation. And they were already facing a perfect storm due to COVID, due to rising food prices, due to insecurities, due to conflict chiefly. And all that this conflict has done in Ukraine is to compound those difficulties. And those countries could at least rely on the food that we were able to transport to them through the port and out of Ukraine. So once that is stymied, once we're not able to do that, this is really threatening to topple several countries over the edge.
And it is my understanding that it's also because of some disruptions in the fertilizers market, which might be felt around the world. Я би зараз хотів би...
Now, I would like to ask a different question. Talk about the evacuation and Ukrainian refugees. Throughout these weeks and months of the aggression, we've been hearing that it's been extremely difficult to organize humanitarian corridors to let civilian population flee the affected areas. And there's been some criticism on the ineffectiveness of the international system, which is there to find solutions. And we understand that also a lot of problems are caused by the lack of willingness from the other side to organize these humanitarian corridors. So my question is to Saviano. How do you deal with these challenges?
Well, I think you explained well. We have not reached the agreements that we need with both parties to make this work. I think we also, in the last weeks, we did manage, and we saw that it's possible. We did the evacuations together with our colleagues from the National Committee of the Red Cross of people from Mariupol and Azovstal. We had 3 rounds of evacuations. We managed to get to safety in Zaporizhia more than 600 people. And this was possible because we had an agreement with both the Ukrainian government and the Russian Federation. These operations, they have to be agreed by both parties of the conflict. There is no way we can do a safe evacuation. The safe passage is with agreement with both parties. If one of the parties don't agree, we cannot do the work. We are seeing here that there are initiatives from one of the parties of volunteers doing whatever they can to support people trying to flee this area, but this is not safe because we're talking about I mentioned before, is a conflict area, or war zone. So people living areas without agreement of a safe passage, there are risks, and we saw in many occasions passes that have been hit and by hostilities in this environment. So we keep our engagements. We are talking the most high levels with both parties to make sure that we can operate more safe passages, so people that are stranded, trapped in areas experiencing tense hostilities, if they want to leave, they could do so and do it safely.
Could you give us any details on the negotiations about Mariupol and about our fighters on the Azovstal factory?
On the fighters, I cannot enter into these details. It's not the UN mandate. We're not operationally involved on the evacuation of the fighters. This is an agreement between the 2 countries. On the other evacuation of civilians, I can talk about what we did before. We normally don't say in advance what's going to happen because it could jeopardize our operation. So we are in negotiations, of course. We are talking with the countries, and we will keep talking and pressuring them and calling on them to agree on the safe passages. And this is our mandate, it's our work, and we're going to be doing whatever it takes to make sure that we can rescue people that want to leave these areas.
Next question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Lesa Solovchuk. It's the Page Media. My question is on the refugees. Now, quite a lot of people are returning back to Ukraine. Do you know how many of them are returning back? you have any figures? Also, I'm interested in cash assistance from the UN. How many people have gone the cash assistance? We know that it's popular and there are sometimes long queues to get this cash assistance, so that is my question. And the third question is also on the figure. What do you think should be the general fund to support Ukraine? What should be the general sum? And we start with Viktoriia Andrievska. Thank you so much for this question. Let me start with the return of Ukrainian refugees into Ukraine. Indeed, lately UNHCR has seen quite a few people moving back, but it's still too early to say it is a stable trend because the situation is still volatile. So it's difficult to say whether all the people are coming back to stay permanently in the country or they are just coming back temporarily and then they will return back to the countries where they took shelter. In terms of the figures, you can find the figures on the website of the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. I think recently they have mentioned that about 1,600,000, if I'm not mistaken, have returned into Ukraine. But it's very, very difficult to tally it completely and to say that it is a stable trend. In terms of the second question, indeed, cash assistance is very, very important because we understand that people who have left their homes quite often, well, they couldn't take all the essentials they need. They could just grab a bag with whatever they had, and now the IDPs have lots of needs. That's why we had this program of paying cash assistance, so that people would buy the essentials, medicines, maybe some clothes and food, and also probably pay for renting their accommodation. So this program exists, and it's quite active. At the moment, we have over 300,000 people who registered for this cash assistance. And you probably know that within 3 months, there will be payments. It's a small support, a small payment, but still it's very important for every IDP. Viktoriia, there's also a question about the general figure. Do you know the general figure of support? Okay, Saviano.
On the general figures, just to add to what my colleague Viktoriia said, in total, our organizations, UN and partners providing cash assistance here in Ukraine, we are reaching now almost 700,000 people. And we are scaling up very fast now. It was challenging at the beginning with the registration process, so we had some delays, as you all might know. But now we are reaching almost 700,000 people now, and we are increasing by 100,000 each week. So you are at scale now, and we're reaching people with this cash assistance. As my colleague Viktoriia said, is one of the most dignifying ways that we can support people. They can make their own choices on what they need to do for them. On the funding that you asked as well, the United Nations and humanitarian partners here launched an appeal 6 days after the war started, and we revised it recently. Now we have a request for international community to support us with 2.25 billion in funding for the humanitarian response here. We have to say that the support is remarkable. We received so far 1.3 billion, almost 6% of the total that we requested. It is enabling the humanitarian response to take place, but of course it is still not the total that we need, and we're going to keep revising these figures as the war is not even close to end, and humanitarian needs are still growing. So we're probably going to revise these figures soon, and we're going to have a new request, but so far we have 60% of what we requested funded.
I would like to switch to healthcare, and my question will be to Margaret Harris. We understand that there are several factors which make the situation with healthcare in Ukraine right now very difficult. First, it includes the damages to the physical, medical, or healthcare infrastructure. We know that many hospitals were damaged or destroyed. Some of them were specifically targets of the Russian attacks, including airstrikes. Secondly, obviously, there is a huge effect of the very dramatic and drastic fighting. And third is the COVID and the consequences of that. What's your suggestions? How all these losses can be substituted, or what can be done about that, and how the international community can help Ukraine with that?
Thank you. That's a really good question. What existed before, as I mentioned, was a health system that had really been strengthened by reform. And one of the things that was really critical was the ability to provide primary care close to where people were through mobile teams. And now that sort of work, we've seen this particularly with mental health, psychological services, providing mobile teams that go reach people and ensure that the people with most severely psychiatric illness could actually be reached. That can be applied to other types of healthcare. So we as the international community are working very hard with the Ministry of Health, we as WHO, I should say, to ensure that we support mobile teams that can reach the needs where they're needed, but also support people within the hospitals where they are with the kind of supplies that weren't needed before, things like trauma care, the increased amounts of intravenous fluids, blood fridges, even things like special orthopedic materials. There's something called external fixateurs that you put on broken limbs to hold the bones together so that you can avoid amputation. And we've been really increasing the amount of training we do with all the surgeons, who you've got fantastic surgeons here, but they weren't expecting to do war surgery. So they've had to then train to find ways to deal with people who have been either wounded in fighting, but also due to explosions and destruction when missile attacks have occurred. We've also been looking at preparations for management or for management of, say, chemical attacks or other disruptions. So there's a great deal we can do. But as I said before, the most important thing we can all do is bring about peace.
One last question before we do the wrap-up. Мікрофон, прошу сюди.
Yes, I would like to ask Ms. Harris on what are your recommendations in case there's a chemical attack. And one more quick question, if I may. You've said that, for example, that a coping strategy in case of lack of food might be the adults having less food and giving more to children. So what are other coping strategies or recommendations?
Mentioned actually the biggest risk is there's an advanced industrial this has got an industrial economy, and you have many plants and so on where when there is bombing, chemicals can be released. So that's what I was referring to. But indeed, we are working with the authorities to ensure, and with the health system to ensure that if that should occur, if there is danger of chemical spillage, that the preparations are in place to protect people, and that the doctors and nurses and the paramedics, the ambulance services know exactly what to do. So that's really, really important. On people, exactly, you're absolutely right to mention when people are hungry, when they're displaced, when they're cold, their immune systems are weakened, and there is a much increased risk of infectious diseases particularly, because that's what your immune system fights. So that's why we really are saying we must scale up immunization, because being vaccinated gives you that power to fight an infection even when your immune system is in a weaker state. So it's absolutely critical that if offered vaccination, or if your children are offered vaccination, make sure you get it done.
I'll take that this question has been answered. And my last question to all of you will be this: what are the lessons learned from this war and from this crisis? I think you hear it from the Ukrainian people that there is a huge demand for the United Nations system to improve, to adjust, and to provide better support and better help to nations like ours that happen to be in the armed conflicts and in the wars. So I'll invite those of you who are ready to speak on the lessons learned, what the United Nations system and what the international system should learn from this war.
What I have to say is that too many lives here have been torn apart because of this war. And we are doing what we can to support them. It's not easy to operate on a war zone. It's not, we don't do at the pace that maybe we wanted when it started, but still, it was one of the most ferocious conflicts that we saw in the last period, in the recent story. We have, as I said before, 25% of people of Ukraine had to leave their houses. And it's not that simple to make sure that we reach them at the speed that they want. We had to establish here in Ukraine a whole entire humanitarian system to support these people. And I do think that we did at the fastest way that we could with the resource that we had at this moment. We're gonna keep making it work. We're gonna keep working to make sure that we can reach more and more people each day. But we have to have into consideration that some of the challenges that we have here go beyond of our capacity and has to be solved and agreed by the Ukrainian government and the Russian Federation so we can support people whoever they are, wherever they are.
Viktoriia Andrievska.
I think, well, in terms of lessons learned or these important ideas which would help us respond, we are collecting these ideas from all over the world because UNHCR is operating all over the world in the most complicated situations. And what's really important for us is to deploy our operations as fast as possible. This is the priority because in the very first months, I mean, these first months really matter for the humanitarian assistance. That's why for us it was a lot of effort to deploy our operations, all the logistics centers, to be able to send aid to different corners of the country. This was the most important. And now we already have a network of local partners, staffers, local communities, and will continue these efforts. Margaret Harris.
Please.
Yes, and I think the first thing is clearly the worst disease we know is war, because it inflicts damage on all aspects of health, all levels of health. But the second lesson is when you're in a country like this that was already in health reform, already building up the health, as the damage occurs, you keep building. You don't wait for the end. You keep building now. We keep working with the Ministry of Health and building now so that what is there at the end is even better.
Well, Anthem, World Food Programme.
I think this conflict underlines the catastrophic impact of conflict on hunger, the #1 driver of hunger globally, and that has been underlined by this war and by its impact within Ukraine and throughout the world. I think we've seen the importance of working to support the government, to complement the systems already in place, social protection systems, for example, through the cash transfers that we provide, and supporting the local government that way, ensuring that local economy, jobs, livelihoods are sustained within the country and being there as a support for that. Also, we've underlined the importance of working in partnership, working in an alliance with humanitarian agencies, of NGOs on the ground and with other partners, complementing each other's skills, making sure we don't duplicate. These are all key pointers that we take from this emergency.
Viktoriia Mykhalchuk.
I will briefly add to what Paul said. Indeed, this war is reaching far beyond Ukraine. when we talk about Ukraine, locally we have very good partnership relationship with um, many organizations, and this helps us reach more people with aid. And indeed, these small organizations locally, they were able to respond faster. That's why we are working through these local partners to be able to provide aid to people in need as fast as possible. Thank you so much, Saviano. Abreu, United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
Andrievska, United Nations Refugee Agency, Margaret Harris, World Health Organization, Paul Anthem, World Food Program, Viktoriia Mykhalchuk, Food and Agriculture Organization. I would like to thank you, your teams, your agencies for supporting Ukraine, for helping us to get through this war and this crisis, and stand with Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Andrievska. On behalf of the Media Center Ukraine, I welcome all the reporters who are telling the world about our fight for freedom. Today, Ukraine commemorates a very sad day. It's the commemoration of the barbaric deportation of the Crimean Tatars. The campaign was organized by Joseph Stalin in 1944. We'll talk about this with Alim, the co-founder of the Crimea-SOS Foundation and deputy executive director of the Ukrainian Institute. Hello. I hope you can hear me. So, what is the current mood of Crimean Tatars? Today is the Crimean Tatar Deportation Day, and this is the date which Crimean Tatars commemorated throughout all the years after the return to their homeland, because during the deportation, almost half of all the Crimean Tatar people perished. And today, this date is not just a day of remembrance of our ancestors, but also we have to remember that genocides is something Russia has been doing systematically since 18th century. It's just the systemic policy of the Russian Empire. And by Russian Empire, I mean both the Soviet Union and today's Putin's regime. It's the policy against three nations. And we see that the genocides committed by Russia in the territory of Ukraine, unfortunately, we have just another confirmation of that. After the occupation of Crimea by the Russian Federation in 2014, the Crimean Tatars were targets of the oppressions by the occupational government. We know that Majlis of the Crimean Tatar nation has been banned. We know that there were personal repressions over Crimean Tatar activists. Why is this Crimean Tatar fact so important for the occupational authorities? It's easy. Crimea, since 2014, is essentially a neo-colony of Russia. So when we are talking about the violations of human rights, it's just the top of the iceberg. There are at least 4 elements of changes in the peninsula. Firstly, the peninsula gets militarized. For 8 years, we've been saying that Russia is arming Crimea to its maximum possible extent. We now see rockets flying from Crimea to other parts of Ukraine because they are using Crimea as the bridgehead, and also they militarize the minds of people since kindergarten. Next factor is the oppression of free media and the ruination of our national institutions, such as Majlis, the National Assembly of the Crimean Tatar nation. Next, we have the brain drain. Over 50,000 people leaving Crimea, but instead, Russia has been sending at least 500,000 new population. So they replace the ethnic composition of Crimea, and this is the violation of the international humanitarian law. It's just part of the colonization policies. And the last but not the least is the change in identity. Everything which is not in line with the Russian paradigm must be destroyed. This is what they think. They destroy Crimean Tatar language. They destroy the Crimean Tatar cultural heritage and Ukrainian cultural heritage. So the policies mentioned, well, it started back in the 18th century. when there was the first occupation of Crimea, when they started bringing in Russians to Crimea, and Crimean Tatars who were repressed were forced to leave to the Ottoman Empire. So why do they pay so much attention aggressively to Crimean Tatars? Is it because they see Crimean Tatars as a threat, or this is just lack of tolerance to whatever is not in line with Russian imperial identity? Yes, a threat. Any strong identity, when you have the answer, the question, who are you and why this land is important for you personally, it poses a threat to Russian security system. So this war against Ukraine is also war for identity. And the Russians certainly do not need Crimean Tatars who claim to be at home in their homeland and who remember their history and who understand that Crimean Tatars will definitely be living in their land and developing it. The same can be said about all other territories of Ukraine, because Russia wants to see us as a colony, and it's like the phantom pain of the empire. It manifests as war and genocide. What has changed in Crimea after February the 24th? Well, obviously, in the last 8 years, Crimea has been living in fear. However, there are still a lot of free people living in Crimea who organize resistance, who conduct systemic policies to maintain Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar identity. From February the 24th, we have seen a very strong movement by Russia to impress people in Crimea militarily. We also see the increase the in the troops and equipment movement, but also there are these guerrilla movements when blue and yellow colors are used, for example, to paint the doors of the occupational administration in Eupatoria, or in Sevastopol. We see the inscriptions Bucha and Irpin on park benches. We see a Crimean Tatar teacher at school who is scolding a child for having Z on the T-shirt. And well, later she had to quit. She was repressed essentially. So we see these attempts of resistance, and the Crimean residents are telling me that now they are essentially significantly more optimistic regarding the deoccupation than a year before. And today, it's important for us to say that a lot of Crimean Tatars are now in the Ukrainian army, and we appreciate that. A lot of Crimean Tatars are now volunteers who work in the humanitarian front, in the information front. Today, our victory, today our victory will be part of our joint, our shared victory of all Ukraine, the all Western civilization. The situation in the occupied territories in the south of Ukraine, how is it different from what we've seen in Crimea in 2014? Or let me rephrase it. The situation in Kherson, Berdyansk, Melitopol, is it similar to what Crimea saw in 2014, or is it different? I really have flashbacks when I hear about Kherson in 2022. Flashbacks to Crimea 2014. The first thing an occupier does when it occupies the territory, it tries to just throw activists and reporters to cellars, or they simply kidnap people. This is what we see now in Kherson Oblast. the TV channels are disconnected. They try to organize fake referendums, and they fail. And it's the resistance of the local population. It's important to tell about this. The resistance in Crimea in 2014, and there are also fantastic attempts to show resistance, to show popular protests in 2022. What is different also is that in Kherson, um, they came in from another occupied territory, and they already had Russian flags. In Crimea, first they came in as these little green men without any insignia. So now the story of the occupation, it's the story of destroyed lives and destroyed institutions. So, what are the grounds for the optimism uh, to make sure that 2014's events will not be scaled up in other areas? Well, now uh, Putin's Russia is going all in, and they will fail. I don't see a different future for Russia. It can only collapse. So today it's important. Today it's important for us to stay strong, to hold our ground, and to try as much as possible to kick back the occupiers from our land. We also are optimistic because the whole world now sees that Russia is, well, it's new Nazism. This is the history which happened into the 20th century, and nobody could think that it can uh, also be quite real in the 21st century. So this support matters. Also, we must say that, well, what's victory for us? The return of the Ukrainian flag to Crimea would be a victory, because our war started with that peninsula, and after Crimea we saw the takedown of MH17, we saw war in Syria, we saw the intervention in the elections in other countries, we saw this total smearing propaganda campaign. All these efforts by Russia, well, this cycle should be stopped, and it should be stopped with the liberation of Crimea. Thank you. Alim Aliev, the co-founder of the Crimea-SOS Foundation and Deputy Executive Director of the Ukrainian Institute, spoke about the commemoration of the Crimean Tatar deportation, the situation in Crimea, and about our hope that in the new circumstances we will have a real chance to liberate Crimea. Thank you, Alim. Our next briefing will start at 11:30. We are looking forward to Mr. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Andriy Shevchenko. On behalf of the Media Center Ukraine, I welcome all the reporters who are telling the world about our fight for freedom. Next speaker is Pavlo Kyrylenko, Donetsk military civilian governor. Pavlo, we have had some information that in the last 24 hours, 28 settlements in the Oblast have been shelled by the Russian occupiers. What are the hottest points in the map of your Oblast? We will need to reconnect to Pavlo Kyrylenko, the head of Donetsk military civilian administration. And while we are doing that, we are looking forward to having the briefing of Vadym Boichenko, the mayor of Mariupol, at 1 o'clock. And we hope to learn more about Mariupol and learn more details about the situation with the Ukrainian heroic defenders of Mariupol, who up until recently have been defending the city, defending the Azovstal plant. And we will also be updating you about our subsequent briefings soon. All of the announcements. Ladies and gentlemen, we continue our briefing with Pavlo Kyrylenko, the head of Donetsk Regional Military Civilian Administration. Pavlo, in the last 24 hours, according to the official information, 28 settlements in the region have been shelled by the Russian occupiers. So what are the hottest points in the map of your region? Hi. All the front line throughout all the front line, there's shelling day and night in Marinka, in Krasnogorivka, Vuhledar, Avdiivka, Toretsk, Velika Novosilka, also in Volnovakha Ryan. So in the last 24 hours, in Bakhmut, in Konstantinivka, Soledar, there also have been airstrikes, and they are quite remote. I mean, it was 20-30 kilometers from the front line, which is considered a more distant from the front line settlement. So there, they destroyed 3 schools, 1 dormitory, and they have almost completely destroyed the Knauf factory. It was an international investment project, the Knauf factory, which was producing construction material. So the enemy is destroying the civilian infrastructure. Not only on the front line, they are also conducting airstrikes further from the front line. So the school in Avdiivka was also shelled, and we have heard reports that white phosphorus bombs were used for that. Can you explain the logic? Does it mean that the school was a deliberate target of the occupiers? What happened there? Well, they just want to destroy the infrastructure and to sow havoc and terror. And the logic of the occupier is simple. They drop the bomb. They use the old Soviet bombs, unguided bombs, like Fab 500. It's the Second World War type bomb, unguided. So it can hit the target, or maybe it will not hit the target, like in Kramatorsk. There were many high rises, like on May 5th, this FAP bomb it just has hit the high rise, and the windows were shattered, like the building was destroyed. It was an unguided bomb. They do use phosphorus ammunition, and they are very difficult to put down because they uh, are incendiary, so they cause fires. And even if the building is not destroyed by the explosion, then there's fire, and the firefighters are responding to this. But when there is constant shelling, it's very difficult to put down fires because the lives and safety of the firefighters are the priority. So sometimes the fires just keep on going. Also, they want to sow panic among the population because these phosphorus munitions have quite a big radius. They hit quite an area. And of course, people want these shellings to just stop. The enemy understands that they can't sometimes take the city easily, so they want to sow panic among the population, so the population would also mm, want peace in any way. But we understand these tactics, so we are just trying to organize evacuation of the population. It will be easier for us to resist the occupiers. What are the news from Mariupol? Well, the leadership of the Ministry of Defense have given you the news. I can't give any more details because every Ukrainian now has to be very sensitive approaching this. We don't want to hurt our defenders. We will be commenting on the procedure post factum after, thank God, they will return home. This is about the Azovstal. But besides the situation in Azovstal and our defenders, what do you hear about Mariupol in general, and what are the Russians doing there? They are trying um, to organize some sort of order there, but no, from 2019, I've been the head of the region, but it's not about me. I understand very well how difficult it is to make the biggest city in the Oblast modern and contemporary. Not just painting the facades, but uh, building the internal things, setting up internal communications. This is what the City Council of Mariupol has been doing, and the region, of course, invested a lot. We did this with joint effort. So now, when everything is destroyed beyond repair, and the communications are also destroyed. So it's not really easy to set up gas supply or power supply when the whole grid is destroyed. So the occupier is, well, only making things worse now. The food security and potable water supply is still very complicated. The General Staff of Ukrainian Army reported this morning that the enemy is now focusing with the offensive in what's called Donetsk Ryan and Slaviansk direction. Can you explain us what this means? Yes, Slaviansk direction is where Donetsk region is bordering Kharkiv region. Indeed, they have this large-scale offensive in Donbass from the north of the region. They started near Dolgino. This is the entrance to Donetsk Oblast. When you pass Izium, as soon as you leave Izium, there's the first roadblock of the Donetsk Oblast. But the actions to defend the city, and the bravery and the professionalism of the Ukrainian army, they have changed the plans of the occupiers. The plan was to act fast, to just go along the highway and to reach probably Sloviansk. Well, I don't know what were the plans of the occupier, but to capture Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, because these two cities are very near each other. As soon as the enemy understands that they can't come through because of the losses, because of the losses in troops and equipment, and the enemy started attacking the Liman direction, so trying to go around. The enemy is distributing the forces to the left and to the right side, and now there's active combat. It's May 18th, so for about 3 weeks there have been attacks in Liman direction. Ukrainian army is controlling the town of Liman, but the enemy is really trying to attack. The enemy has captured Crimea and is trying to attack Liman. So their plans are quite clear. So we know where they tried to cross the Seversky Donetsk River, and you know what was the outcome. All Ukraine saw, and internationally in Europe, they saw the outcome of these attempts to cross the river. So we are ready to defend the north of the region. The Donetsk direction, that's Avdiivka. Today there were also attempts to break through. Our army is holding its ground, and the enemy well, they just send in more troops. They just have a lot of troops and equipment, but, well, we've been destroying them and we'll keep defending our homeland up until the moment when we will be able to have counterattacks. And there's the south of the region. This is where the army have been showing heroism. I mean, I understand that it might be a superficial explanation, but I've seen the map and the events, the front line, and I understand how heroic are the defenders of Mariupol. The southern direction is essentially Mariupol, and the Russians wanted to attack from the south, but Mariupol was the safeguard, and what the defenders of Mariupol did, well, it changed the whole campaign of the enemy. They had to withdraw some troops there, and they wanted to redistribute the troops to and send part to Zaporizhia and some to Kurakhova. And if the local population thinks that well, all the combat activities are in Slovensk and Kramatorsk, there are rocket strikes and there are air strikes from time to time. Yes, indeed, but we can hold in the north because of the professionalism of the Ukrainian army. The enemy has not encircled those cities, and this is how it is. My last question. We see how this grand battle for Donbass well, lowers the demands of the Russian occupiers. First, they planned to encircle all the east of Ukraine up until Zaporizhia and Dnipro. Then they started saying about the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. Now we see that they only focus on Slaviansk and Kramatorsk there. So, what are the grounds for optimism for you when you're looking at this battle? My optimism, overall in my life, not only when there's the full-scale invasion, we'll have to understand that in Donetsk, this war has been lasting from 2014, but my optimism, well, it follows realism, it follows the realities. In this case, we have to see how the enemy is changing their plans. And while the professionalism of the army uh, is just pushing the enemy into changing their plans. So we have to increase the intensity of this resistance, because it can't turn up into a frozen conflict. I can fully support the president when the president says that we can't talk about freezing this conflict, because we've been holding strong. When people actually didn't believe this is possible, but we did, and we have to liberate all the territory. We don't need even an acre of the territory of other states, especially the state with which we only have a shared border. There's nothing else shared with them, and we will not have anything shared with them after this. But we have to liberate our territory, Ukrainian territory. We have to rebuild it and make it a modern European state. Pavlo Kyrylenko, the head of Donetsk military regional administration. Our next briefing is at 1 o'clock. We'll talk to the mayor of Mariupol, Vadym Boichenko. Thank you, Pavlo.
Пані та панове, мене звати Андрій Шевченко.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Andriy Shevchenko. On behalf of the Media Center Ukraine, I welcome all the reporters who are telling the world about our fight for freedom. Our next guest is Vadym Boichenko, the mayor of Mariupol. Hello, Vadym. What are the latest news from the city? Well, the situation in this city has been dire in Mariupol. We've heard some good news, however, that our president, Vladimir Zelensky, has been involved in saving the lives of our heroes, the defenders of the heroic city of Mariupol. So I would like to say thanks to Volodymyr Zelensky, the president, the International Red Cross and UN, who joined efforts to save the lives of the local population and our heroic warriors who for over 80 days have been holding grounds when the enemy had several times more troops, but what's important is that the guys helped us defend the rest of Ukraine and be prepared. And today we are working to save their lives. So if you can share some information, please tell us what is going on with these warriors who are now taken from Azovstal. I have already commented what I could. Unfortunately, the topic is very sensitive and very delicate. The negotiations mission is there. Unfortunately, I can't say anything else. Can you tell us who is engaged in the negotiations? The President of Ukraine, the International Red Cross, the UN, and there is the negotiation mission. At different levels, I would say. Okay, so let us talk about the situation in the city overall. Besides the topic of Azovstal and the topic of liberating our heroic soldiers from the besieged factory, what's the situation in the city? We know that the situation, well, there is humanitarian problem in the city. There is lack of food. There's no potable water in this city. The city has been living without power supply. And the city today has no conditions for providing healthcare. There's no medicine. And another important component, which turns into a very big issue, is the epidemic component, infectious diseases. Well, now summer is starting in this city, and the city needs more water for sanitation. Also now Mariupol, well, the sewage is not working. So we have to understand that over 100 people are still living in Mariupol, and it is a problem. We have qualified doctors who are now drawing the attention to the fact that it might be a huge problem, both the environmental disaster and the epidemic might start. The UN also has been saying that there might be an outbreak of cholera or dysentery, and this unfortunately can take lives of thousands of the locals. So we have to come together around this problem, the lack of full-scale evacuation from this city. We have to have, like, the UN and the ICRC should work on this. The whole civilized world has to come together to prevent these disasters, to make sure there are corridors so that the residents of Mariupol would be able to leave for the territory under Ukrainian control. Unfortunately, today, we see that it's almost impossible. According to international conventions and international law, resolving humanitarian issues, you've mentioned, is in the sphere of responsibility of the occupier. So, what is being done now by the Russian occupiers in the city? Do they resolve these humanitarian issues somehow? They are trying to do something, but we see that they do not have professional experience. They have tried to join the power grid, and those few apartments which still were intact, essentially they were burned down because they didn't test the power grid and caused fire. Also, they're trying to connect the water supply, but they don't understand that it's a comprehensive system which has to work comprehensively with the sewage. And now the water is just flowing down the streets of the city. And unfortunately, it has only caused bad consequences because now uh, the locals and these terrorist troops of the DNR, they've been burying many people, the victims of the killings. So the water essentially is now flooding these graves, and it causes the environmental problem and the epidemic problem, because this dirty water is just moving in an unorganized manner towards rivers and towards the sea. So in summer, this will be a very big problem. That is why we're urging everyone to come together, so that we would create the conditions for the evacuation, so that our residents would have this ability. And thousands of residents of Mariupol have been calling the hotline of the municipality, and they were begging to be safe, begging to have evacuation. But we see that now the Russian occupation forces and these DNR, so-called, they are not enabling this. If there are questions in the audience, please let me know. And I would like to ask a question about the evacuation of the civilian population. How many people remain in Mariupol who would want to leave the city but do not have this opportunity? Well, in the city overall, there are over 100,000 people. In order to have accurate figures, we need to have some stable evacuations. If every week the buses are leaving, if people are seeing that these buses are leaving towards Ukraine, they will have confidence to evacuate. There were thousands of people, but throughout the last month, they didn't have a stable possibility to leave for Ukraine. We've organized these evacuations, but they were only small scale and sporadic. So people are looking forward to these corridors. So people are waiting. They are calling the hotline. They are begging us to save their lives. That's why we have to work. The most important thing for us, and every life is important. We want to save every soul, and people want to go only towards Ukraine. When you're talking about the environmental and epidemiologic consequences which can happen, you're telling about the danger which can start in summer. What exactly could be the consequences? We see that the UN has been saying, and our qualified doctors are saying that, well, we can have outbreaks of infectious diseases, of dysentery and cholera. Because in Mariupol there's no proper sanitation. The sewage is not working, and there are mass burials created by the Russian army. They've killed over 20,000 population. Unfortunately, now people are still buried there. So rains and other conditions in summer, this certainly would affect this epidemiological component. We've seen in the recent month the brutality with which the enemy has been attacking Mariupol. Do you have an opinion why the Russians have had such a strong hatred towards this city? Why is it so crucial for them? It's my personal opinion. I've been born in Mariupol. I brought up my children there. My son is now um, in the army, in the Ukrainian army. And every second person in Mariupol somehow has Russian roots historically. Today, 95% of the population is Russian speaking in the city. So, of course, we have many questions. Why? So, my personal opinion on this is like, why it's happened that they just destroyed the city? Like, 50% of the city is burned down, it's just ashes. There might be only some carcasses of the buildings. So they really were brutal here. Why? Because in 2014, like overall in the East, the Russian military leadership, military and political leadership, suggested this so-called Russian world, this Russianness, under the name of DNR and LNR, and Mariupol has been under this influence for 2 months, but it didn't fall for this propaganda, and the DNR did not spread onto the territory of Mariupol. So Mariupol left the city. So I think the first component is that we were standing strong, and they thought it's an insult. And another factor is that when Russia occupied Donetsk, which has been a beautiful developing city, very European, very modern, there was lots of development because the city was in Ukraine. And when we see that under the occupation, in these 8 years of war, Donetsk, unfortunately, has only been in ruination. Nothing's been happening there. In Mariupol, under the Ukrainian flag, it was improving. There were modern parks. There was modern urban transport. We've got over 200 million euro of investments. We've built new water supply system, roads, kindergarten, schools. We had the ice rink, ice arena, a swimming pool. We had lots of plans, and the city grew by 30%. People from Donetsk, Kharkiv, Mykhalchuk came in to live in Mariupol. Children from all over Ukraine were coming into the city. The city transformed and became a modern and European city. And we have approved the strategy, the development strategy. It's the seaside city with the ocean of possibilities. And this was irritating for them. They were envious. That's why they were so brutal, Mariupol, because we had courage and they had envy. I would like to add for the reporters who are hearing us and watching us that just like in 2014, Mariupol remains the symbol of Ukrainian courage and the heroic struggles. They helped withdraw the attention of the Russian troops, which Russia wanted to use to occupy the Ukrainian Donbass. My last question here is that yesterday on this stage we had Kalush Orchestra, the band. They said that they simply had to mention Mariupol on the stage of the Eurovision Song Contest. What did you feel when you heard that Kalush addressed the whole Europe asking to save Mariupol? I felt shivers, and I still feel shivers. Thank you so much for supporting Mariupol, and thank you for supporting not just Mariupol, but also our heroic warriors, who gave everything. Some gave their lives. They defended not just our Mariupol, they defended Ukraine. Thanks for supporting. I appreciate every Ukrainian who is supporting Mariupol now. This is the most important now. Mariupol is the symbol of Ukrainian courage, and Mariupol has been and will be a Ukrainian city. Glory to Ukraine. Vadym Boichenko, the mayor of Mariupol, thank you for this conversation.